You're listening to The Valley Current.
You did see the cover of this,
Yeah,
right?
the cover is great. I thought the cover was
great.
brilliant. And the title, say the title, because this is your new book that just came out, some 300 plus pages, right?
Yeah, it's my, what we call my debut novel. It's called The Ghost Case Posse. It's a legal mystery thriller. And it's not my first foray into non-legal writing. I've been writing fiction, short fiction, and creative nonfiction for between 15 and 20 years so far, and have been published in a number of literary magazines. But I decided, I wanted to take a shot at a novel. I'd actually written one before this that is not published. I might publish it at some point, but this one I think has a broader appeal to a wider audience. I mean, it's in the same basic genre as other mystery thrillers by Grisham or people of that sort. I like to think I've done a little bit more with the genre, but that's for the readers to decide. Right?
Yeah, you've extended the genre. The genre has existed for a while, and of course, Grisham has made a small fortune with what must be like 20 or 30 books at this point. I mean, a huge number, right? Titles.
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, that's part of the problems with coming in as and being an indie author, an independent author is, you're up against all these people, and there's not that many of them, but let's say there's 10 to 15 very, well-known authors in that space. I mean, if somebody's looking for a book in that genre, they're going to pick a known author for the most part. So that's the challenge, is trying to get people to to look at, to read it, because if they don't read it, it doesn't matter how good it is.
Have you looked at audio, the audio potential and Audible? Because I think a lot of people these days want to be doing something else while quote unquote reading, namely listening while riding a bike or doing yoga or whatever they do. It's kind of what I do to sort of double up use of my time. And then they like to put it on a faster speed because they think they can absorb it better. But of course, some things are better listened to probably at a slower speed or certainly a regular speed. But have you looked at the Audible?
I sort of looked at it. I decided not to pursue it at this point. The book is out as an ebook now on Amazon and Apple Books and Barnes and Noble. So it's been available for a few weeks on ebook. The print version is on pre-order at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And as I understand it from the people who have ordered the print version, delivery of that is going to start probably in a couple of weeks from now.
So tell us the journey, because you obviously have been a great lawyer for many decades, and you started, I think, if I recall, you went to law school right after graduating Dartmouth. But you tell us the journey, because Dartmouth obviously must have had a big impression on you. And where were you born, and kind of how'd you end up where you are today?
Yeah, I was born in Sacramento, California, and went to a Catholic high school there, Christian Brothers. Excuse me. And in fact, the interesting thing is this book, this novel, is about a fictional defendant who's a copycat of the Golden State Killer, a real life Golden State Killer that many people have heard of. If not, it's pretty easy to find out with a quick Google. But he was somebody who was apprehended years and years after his crimes, multiple rapes, and probably, I think, something like 13 murders. But when I was growing up in Sacramento, actually when I was in college and home for the summers, that particular criminal was known as the East Area Rapist in Sacramento. And he was terrorizing the community. I mean, when I would go home for the summers, I mean, just women would be terrorized. And he was breaking into homes and having the women tie up the husbands and then raping the women and staying in the houses for hours, just, just terrible psychological torture. But they never caught him back then. And then, as it turns out, he left Sacramento and went on to Southern California, and then he got even more violent, and he was doing kind of the same thing, but then he would actually kill the people that he broke, whose houses they broke into.
So you were
And,
reading this stuff in the newspaper and the like back, decades ago, right?
right. And it was so frustrating because, that was before they had DNA evidence. They weren't able to use that. So all they had, and he was a cop. He was a policeman.
Oh,
He
in real life,
actually,
in real life, he had a
in
job, like he
real
had a
life,
full-time job.
yeah, this is the real life Golden State Killer. Now, again, the book is not about him. It's a fictional novel about somebody who's a copycat. But I think it's helpful to know about the real guy, and I go into a little bit of that in the book. But it's helpful because it's the same basic situation where he went and was not apprehended for years until these cold case detectives started using DNA, and they would look in DNA databases and then compare the rape kits, from decades before to try to figure out whether the DNA could be matched up. And then they find relatives of the person, right? And then after that, they start doing this sleuthing where they start deciding, well, how far off a relative is this person from the DNA from the rape kit. And then they start, doing all kinds of internet research and research into family trees until they kind of try to come up with a few suspects who it possibly could be. In other words, somebody who was of the age they think would be appropriate for that criminal and in the area. And then they track them and they follow them to some place like a fast food restaurant and pick up their cup after they leave, and then they test the DNA, and that's how they caught this guy. And then, it turned out it was the same guy who had done crimes in Visalia. He was originally known as the Visalia. Visalia is, a town in the Central Valley here in California. He was known as the Visalia ransacker. Although he did commit one murder there, it was mostly he would just break into houses and steal stuff, like wedding rings and photos, just kind of this psychological torture. And then he moved on, became the East Area rapist, and then he headed south. And it turned out it was the same guy that did all that stuff.
How did you build a research file? It sounds like you did a lot of factual research.
No, I mean, a lot of that was just seared in my memory from growing up. But once he was apprehended, I think it was 2018, then I started, looking into the connections and reading more because there was a lot about him on the internet. It's interesting because there was a woman who was a crime writer who was the wife of the comedian Patton Oswalt. I think her name was Michelle McNamara, and she became obsessed with this guy and was writing a book about him, but ended up dying. I don't know whether it was an overdose or it might have been. I don't want to say because I don't remember for sure, but she died before she finished the book. And so Patton Oswalt with some other people finished the book, but that was before he was apprehended. And then after he was apprehended and charged, again, I think it was around 2018, that somebody did a documentary which was sort of more about the crime writer Michelle McNamara and the book she was writing was kind of more about her and her journey than so much of a historical documentary of this guy's crimes. But one of the things they did was they interviewed a lot of the victims, the surviving victims of this guy. And it was just so heartrending as how he had wrecked their lives. And so many of the people who were attacked as couples got divorced, and it was just terrible. And it was then actually watching that documentary when I started thinking, geez, how would you react if you were a victim of somebody? And here he's apprehended. I think he was like 72. I mean, again, we're talking about the real guy now, but he was right. 72 when they apprehended. So he pretty much lived a full life. And then, of course, by that time, Governor Newsom had put a moratorium on the death penalty. mostly because of concerns about how it's used against minorities, not against white guys like this guy.
White cops,
And
white cops,
cops, yeah,
right?
cop.
Who
And
obviously have detailed knowledge about how to leave a crime scene without leaving a lot of trace behind, right?
exactly, and that's exactly what he did. The only thing that he left behind was the semen, because back then that didn't get you. You could that didn't get you very far. I mean, you might be able to blood type it. In fact, I think there were times when there were rumors going around that maybe this guy is a cop, and the cops in the Sacramento area were were submitting the blood test to try to show that they weren't within the same blood type, or if they were, that they had alibis or whatever. So that's kind of what started getting me thinking about this. And I was thinking, how do you react to that if you're a victim? How does that affect your sense of justice when this guy has done so much terrible, intentional, terrible crimes and psychological crimes? And then how does that affect you as a defense lawyer? Because the main character in my novel is Jedediah Bouvier, or Jed Bouvier, who's 42 years old. He's a public defender. I set it in a fictional county north of Sacramento called Murrieta County, mostly because I didn't want any implication that I was talking about that my fictional characters were real people, right?
Right.
And so I set it in a fictional county, and so he's a public defender, very ideological guy, went into criminal defense because his uncle had been railroaded back when he was a boy and ended up getting murdered in prison. And so he's a very ideological guy in terms of, and very anti-death penalty. But now his life is a mess. The book actually starts when the second trial, the retrial of this guy, ends and goes to the jury. The first trial ended in a hung jury, but it kind of messed up his life, and he was an alcoholic and he got divorced, and so he's dealing with that throughout the book. And I think, unlike some other or many of the cases, I mean, not cases, but fictional accounts that deal with death penalties and movies, books, or whatever,
Right.
I think a lot of them sort of, it's either that the defendant really didn't do it and they're getting railroaded for something they didn't do, or if they did
Right.
do it, they were abused, or that they're kind of not really responsible for for what they ded. And so this is different because, and again, each reader has to make his or her own decision about what they think, what they think of the evidence and all that. But I believe that most readers will say, well, there's no doubt that this guy committed the murder that he committed, and that he's just a terrible human being. That he's got no excuse. That he was sort of a arrogant, bitter guy that wanted to be a Hollywood screenwriter and failed, and never could really accept it. And he was a janitor because he couldn't do anything else at that point in his life. And he was, he became privy to the files of the East Area Rapist because he was a janitor at the sheriff's office that had the records.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was able to really get into the details of stuff that weren't all made known to the press, because back then the press kind of is a little bit different today. They worked, I think, a little bit more closely with the law officers, police, and DAs and all that stuff. And they were trying not to give out all the details, because they were hoping to somehow surprise the guy. And the law enforcement people were hoping that they would know details that he didn't think they knew, and they could surprise him, but it never came to pass. So a lot of the stuff was not made public back then. So anyway, that's kind of the basic premise of the novel, that you have a copycat of the Golden State Killer, and the first jury for some reason hangs.
Right.
Now we got the second jury, and they're having problems.
The same lawyer, the same public defender tried the first case to the mistrial that played out, right?
right, and
in the
he's on
book.
the second, and he's on
Right,
the second trial, and of
right.
course, he tried his best to get the guy off, but now he's sort of dealing with that,
Well, we
and
should say
dealing.
we should say, for example, the firm Computer Law Group doesn't do criminal work, but I actually started life as a clerk for a criminal defense appellate attorney, and I remember because I originally wanted to basically after graduating law school, I wanted to do criminal work. I wasn't sure whether it would be trial or appellate work. I was leaning towards trial work, so of course I took the clerkship in the appellate just to see if I'd be missing anything. And what I most remember, and it'll stay with me to the day I die, is the guy looked at me and he said, "Look, you're a really smart guy. You've got a master's degree in computer science. There's a place called Silicon Valley that's obviously all about computers. I know nothing about that. You would be crazy to become a criminal defense lawyer. I'm telling you, based on 40 years of experience, you don't want to do it because the clients, even when you're their appellate lawyer, put the knife in your back and turn it until you're bleeding enough for them to feel like they have power over you." Because he
Right.
would do these great briefs. He was a great writer. And he would say, and they still are not happy. And I send them the brief, and they're like, "This is shit. This isn't what
Uh-huh.
happened." Yeah, like he'd say, "But I can't argue that. It's not in the record. I can't make this shit up." And the guy was very ethical, and I'm sure he's no longer alive because so many years ago, and he was probably in his at least 65 at the time I was working for him, and I was like 20. So yeah, he's probably long gone. I can't remember his name now, but he gave me a career advice and stayed with me forever. And that was what
Yeah.
led me to end up interviewing at what now is Fenwick and West.
Yeah, and I think I have some pretty good scenes between the public defender and his assistant, whose name is
Mm-hmm.
Tara Singh, a woman, a younger woman, and the defendant, whose name, by the way, is Dexter Wayne Jones.
Okay.
Um, it's funny because I've tried to pick names just that you kind of have to pick them out of a hat.
Right. Right.
And there was once an article I read that said it seemed like a lot of criminal defendants had the middle name Wayne for some reason, John
Right.
Wayne Gacy and all that. So I picked
Yeah.
Wayne. But yeah, I think there's some good scenes where there's a real conflict between, the public defender, especially when they're talking about a plea deal, right?
Right.
Because I mean, basically, it's a death penalty case. The prosecutor whose name is Kat Galvez is going for the death penalty. Um, but everybody pretty much knows that first of all, there's a moratorium on it now, and second of all, even if that got lifted, the guy is my defendant, Dexter Wayne Jones, is in his late 60s, and you'd never get around between all the appeals and the writs and all that, you'd never get around to executing him anyway, right?
I mean,
So there's some.
that's the game that appellate lawyers play
Right.
all day long for their
Yeah.
otherwise guilty clients, and that's the
Yeah.
game that defense lawyers play, which is let
Exactly.
the proceedings drag on so the guy can stay alive, even though it's pretty obvious that all the
Yeah.
evidence is pretty much against him. But
And,
you have to
and they
give him a
have
zealous
to.
defense, right?
Right. And they have to do that. The defense lawyers have to do that. And that's part of the tension too is, well, if we don't, what do we do if we don't have these procedures? And, obviously you can tell from reading the blurb on Amazon, or by the way, I guess I didn't mention my website, jgreco.com. I've got, some summaries of the novel, but you can also get it on Amazon, and you can read. I think it's the first 4 chapters, and then I think chapter 6 for free on Amazon. Um, and by the way, right now the ebook is $2.99 on
Yeah, you
Amazon.
can't
So
beat the price. But I want to go back
yeah,
to like 40,000 feet in the air. You
yeah,
graduate from a great Catholic high school. You end up getting into Dartmouth, which is a pretty tough school to get into. And you go, you're successful there. Dartmouth, many people don't realize, was actually had some of the most brilliant people doing computer science. I mean,
John
basically,
Kimmony.
Kemeny was there. There were a lot of people
Yeah,
there. it was actually a very famous place for computer science. You get a degree, and then you decide to go to law school, and that must have been shaped to some degree by what you're describing as the fascination with this killer. But tell me, you didn't decide right off to go to criminal defense, because you didn't do any criminal defense, right? You're writing this
No,
as a civil lawyer, but really as someone kind of fascinated with the case that you do a sort of a story around, right?
yeah, I was always somewhat fascinated by criminal law, but I think I didn't really think I could be a good defense lawyer because I think I would have been too judgmental of my clients. In other words, I'm not sure I really could have gotten into doing what this, my lead character in this novel does, which is just give it your all, no matter how guilty these people are.
Right.
I don't think I could have done that. Now, I suppose I could have gone the prosecution route. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that as I was going through law school. But then again, as you know, was a fairly young father, and I had my oldest son before I graduated from law school, and I needed to make some money. And so I decided to go the civil route, and that's how I started at.
So was this book percolating in the back of your mind, literally from college and law school? Like, how far would you say the original thought about this book was sort of in the percolator?
I really think it was when I saw that documentary, and I'm trying to remember the date, but I think it was somewhere maybe 2020, 2018, between 2018 and 2020. I saw that documentary about the woman who had, died after trying to write a book about this guy, and watching the people whose lives he had ruined, and
Right.
just thinking, wow, I mean, is this justice? I mean, here he is, he was a guy that just deliberately set out to torture people, rape, murder, and torture people. And he was able to live his whole life until he was in his early 70s. And now we've got him. We know he did it. There's no doubt he did it. Now, if there's if we're going to have a death penalty at all, this guy is it. I
Right.
mean, now I understand that there are people that just don't believe that there should be a death penalty at all, no matter what.
Mitch Zimmerman, who we did his interview on a podcast about a year or so ago, and he's written a book. He was a big death penalty defense lawyer on appeal. That's kind of his pro bono work. He was absolutely against the death penalty. It'd be interesting to have both you and him on to discuss whether this type of case should be an exception. But I think Mitch's view is no. No one's got the right to put anyone to death, period, full stop.
And by the way, I did read his book, because when I was starting to think about publishing this, I asked you about, whether you knew things about how to get published and all that stuff. And you had told me, and I listened to the podcast you did with Mitch, and then I actually emailed him about the book, but it bounced back and I wasn't able to get in touch with him. But yeah, I mean, his book that's a good example of a book where, the defendant, in his book, the defendant actually does get executed, and then it's about him, the lawyer, thinking about getting revenge on, certain racist in the South. That's kind of it's kind of like an anti-racist book. But his book, it goes back like 3 generations to try to, I think, I don't want to say make an excuse, because that sounds argumentative, but to try to put into context why the defendant, who was Black, ended up doing a terrible thing. And I think, if, this is my reading of it, not necessarily what Mitch intended, but my reading of it is, society is as much to blame for what he did as he is.
Right. I should drop a footnote here that says, Mitch was also a colleague at Fenwick and West back when we were there. And he never, to me, like, he had written some other books, but they weren't fiction. he had actually had a history before going to law school. And I want to say he had written some books with some medical doctors or psychiatrists or something. He's got some academic history, and I think he wanted to be a professor, but ended up deciding to go to law school as opposed to a PhD program. But Mitch is an interesting guy, and he's still, I think, active, but in a pro bono way. He's older than us by a number of years because he had a career before going to law school. He might well.
Yeah, I remember. I actually worked with him on when I was at Fenwick with you. I worked with him on a case, and he was a few years senior to me in terms of law school. But I knew he was older. But he's actually a lot older than I thought he was.
Right,
so,
right, right. But he's aged well, though. He's aged well. He exercises a lot. He's done. He's an interesting guy. And he's definitely worth following as well. But I'm kind of curious about this sort of kernel of this idea and how you put it into action, because writing a book, having an idea for a book is relatively easy. Actually putting it into words and organizing it and rewriting and editing and revising it and going through all the steps that you went through, which I think you did on your own. I don't think you have a little staff there that's sort of running this production company for you, right? That's not true. It's just you.
No, but I wrote the whole thing on my own, and I don't really have beta readers to read it, so I just kind of went forward with it. And beta readers.
Your wife is not reading every chapter as it comes off the press. Is that what you're telling me?
Let me tell you something. I have to tell you, I'm very proud. I'm going to brag a little bit. I'm very proud because, like I said, I've had now over 20 short stories published in literary magazines, and these are, that's a competitive process. I mean, you send it in, you get mostly rejection. So when you get an acceptance, that's a big deal. And I've been doing that over the years. And I'd say maybe once I get them published, I'll let her read them. And maybe my batting average is 500 with her, or maybe not even 500. She's very blunt when she doesn't like something. And so I didn't have her read the book before I published it, but once I got it and it had a nice cover on it and it was all proofread, and I gave it to her, and I was very apprehensive, but she really liked it. So, and I know if she didn't like it, she would have told me. So that was good. And then I also have another friend who's been, very honest about his reactions to my writing, who liked it. So, but yeah, it took a lot of years to write, a few years to write, I should say. And I was doing other writing at the time. And, but once I decided that I was going to publish it, I tried to find an agent who would take it, because that's the only way you can get, considered by a major publishing house. You got to have an agent. Right. Couldn't get any of them to read it. Yeah. I mean, because it's such a crowded field, and if you're not already a known entity, or you don't at least have some contacts, they kind of, who wants to take on a new client who's a 60-something-year-old, lawyer who I thought my resume was decent with the publications I had with the short stories, but that didn't apparently count for anything.
Right. Right. So no, at that point, I should say, I know a little bit about this because Carol's daughter, Heather, had worked at Creative Artist Agency and then became essentially a reader for a book agent in London. And she did the Harry Potter series with that author. So she had some high profile authors. And I would say to her, how do you decide? And she would often say, there's some really good books that are received, but if they're not ready to make you a star, somehow you don't fit. I'm not going to say this in a negative way, but you're a traditional, well-educated white guy. And, I have to say, if you presented as maybe a minority of some type, and maybe an LBQT, whatever the letters are, kind of author, you decided to pitch it as though that's the author of this book, which I guess you could theoretically have done, maybe, you might actually get someone to say, yes, we want to make this person a star. And I'm saying that just because Heather would say to me, we decide on whether we're going to make someone a star or not, and they've got to fit a certain sort of Overton window in terms of
I mean,
whether it's acceptable
yeah.
or not.
Well, and if you think as an agent, I mean, agents are like contingent fee lawyers. They don't
Yeah,
get paid unless. And so, do you want to put your effort into representing a guy in his late 60s who nobody really knows? And again, like I said, the other, literary magazine stuff apparently carried no weight whatsoever because it's not commercial. I mean, there's no money involved there.
right.
Do is this the guy you want to take on? No. I mean, if the other thing that's interesting that I've found out over the years is that, almost all of the literary agents are, either young to middle-aged women in New York City.
Mm.
So, you're coming out of the Silicon Valley or someplace in California with your first novel and you're looking to. So anyway, that's water under the bridge. I mean, to get back to your question, once I decided, yeah, I really want to publish this thing, then I did, you'll like this, I did AI research and basically said, tell me what's the best way to do that. And I looked at these various places that publishing companies that will
Hmm.
work with you to publish. And so I picked a company called BookBaby. I think I could have done without some of the editing. I don't think the editing was really worth it because I think the book was already in very good shape. It really just needed more like proofreading and
So
um,
did they actually assign a particular editor to you, like a particular individual for the editing of the final copy?
no, not a particular person.
We're talking about your book and how it's now in published form, and we're going to get copies. The firm will pay for copies for each of the people that we have within the
Oh,
firm to read your first novel. And say again what the title is, the exact title is.
the Ghost Case Posse.
Right. How'd you choose the title, Joe? Because that's a pretty unique 4 words. I don't think those 4 words exist anywhere in the world. If you search them on the internet, I don't think you'd find another title or anything
That's
else
interesting.
right? Think about it, because you have to pick
Yeah.
words that communicate. And initially, when I saw the title, I was frankly scratching my head saying, what? What does that stand for? It's obviously a book of fiction. That's the first conclusion. And the second thing, does it involve a ghost? And does it involve a posse? Like those are the two nouns, right? So
Yeah.
tell us how you did that, how you chose that
Well,
title, because titles are pretty important.
interestingly, I was the working title for most of the time I was writing it was the Cold Case Posse because it's a cold case, right?
Right.
And then it turns out there's a couple of organizations that have that name, the
Yeah.
Cold Case Posse.
Right.
And I
Right.
decided I don't want to get into,
Trademark
making people think,
infringement. Right. Trademark,
yeah,
trade
and
name
all that
infringement,
stuff.
trademark infringement. Right.
And so I picked Ghost Case Posse, and I can't really tell you exactly why I picked that without giving away the book uh,
Hmm.
plot. But let's just say that there is a posse. Posse is basically vigilantes, right? Or
Hmm.
at least can be vigilantes. And the ghost case is a reference to kind of how they operate.
Right.
So that's about as much as I can give you without spoiling it.
And just tell me how many person hours, you obviously made a big investment. You're a high paid, high class, highbrow lawyer. You obviously, if you're with a big firm, your rate would be a couple thousand an hour. I'm not saying that you think of your life that way, but in a 2,000 hour period of time, if you worked at a big firm, if I worked at a big firm, we both make, 3, 4, $5 million a year easy. I'm just kind of curious, how do you think about the value of your time when you devote what probably amounted to years in terms of the passage of time? But I don't know, did you keep track of how many hours you ended up putting into the book? I'm kind of curious from
No,
that
no,
perspective.
that's no, because I don't see it as a commercial enterprise per se. I mean, do I want to make money off it? Of course. I mean, if I broke even, I would be happy.
Hmm.
But even if I don't, that's life. I mean, my intent obviously is to to try to get people to buy the book.
You want it to be read and reacted to by like every segment that might read it, from the teenager on up to the retired criminal defense lawyer who's saying, no, you got this wrong, Joe. That's not right. That's not really the way this works.
Yeah, I tried to be careful with, and when I got to criminal procedural stuff that I wasn't sure of, I tried to research it, but it's not a real procedure heavy book. I mean, like I said, most of the legal stuff revolves around the jury deliberations in the second jury. But again, it's like I said, I've been writing short fiction and creative nonfiction for years, and there's no money at all in that. I mean, once in a while, back when there was more print magazines than there are now, they'd give you a couple free copies. Once in a while, someone will pay you $10 or $20 just to show you that they can pay something. But
right,
that's just the labor of love. It's what I like to do. I suppose it would be like somebody that just wants to be the best golfer they can be, even though they know they're never going to be a pro. They still put a lot of effort into it and they love it. And they're proud of when they, break par or whatever.
Right. Rick Rubin wrote a book about creativity that everyone should read. And his argument is you do the creative act for the self-indulgence of the joy that you get from it. If you're doing it for money, you're really doing it for the wrong reason. And you shouldn't be doing it for anything other than kind of the flow state that it puts you in. And the true creative artists that are at their best when they're performing are in a certain flow state that mesmerizes people, because it's sort of such a aspiration to imagine being able to be in that state 7/24, which of course none of us achieve even 5 minutes of daily. Often, if you can get a glimpse of it, that's a beautiful thing.
But you're right, because sometimes when I'm writing, I'll write for 2 hours.
Right. I'm a go back.
And I'll think I've been doing it for 15 minutes. It's just, and the other thing that a lot of people hate doing, which I actually like doing, is editing my own writing. I like to go back and edit. So like whenever I do short stories, like I'm working on one now that's about 4,000 words, and I let it rest. I let it sit for a couple of weeks before I go back and revise it. And it's really amazing what you see. I mean, that's a good thing to do with legal briefs too, if you have the time.
Right.
Right. But no, I mean, you do, when you get accepted as from a literary magazine, it's a big deal. And I guess if I can brag just a little bit too, I just got my first nomination for a Pushcart Prize, which is kind of a big deal in that aspect of the literary world. It's not the prize; it's a nomination. So it's like being nominated for an Emmy or something like that. Doesn't mean you got the prize, but just getting a nomination is nice. So that's the first time I got one of those. So
and how do you go about getting the nomination? You just submit the work, and there's judges that are actually going to score it, and presumably decide a nomination. How does that play out?
No, the small press, it's for small presses. It's for stories published in small presses, and almost all short stories are published by small presses nowadays. And so the press that it's a place out of North Carolina called Smoky Blue Literary and Arts Magazine, and they published it was actually one of my creative nonfictions a few months ago, and they nominated it.
The thought occurs to me that maybe someday there'll actually be someone that'll go on Pacer and actually give a score to a brief. Like, I read a lot of U.S. Supreme Court petitions. I'm just fascinated by them because I think the writing is so shitty by big law firms in particular. And I always sort of think, how would I rewrite this? And I read this stuff and I think to myself, I would score this like a 7 out of 10. And then there are some occasionally that I say, this is really like a 9.9 out of 10. And I've wondered whether there could be something of great value across the entire Pacer system. I'm just looking at Supreme Court stuff and usually very select Supreme Court stuff because they get a lot of garbage, I'm sure, that gets, filed somewhere. But, particularly usually big firms, usually big important cases, like there's a case involving secondary liability of copyright defendants that just got argued yesterday, in fact, and I was, hoping I would be able to listen to the argument. Unfortunately, I couldn't get there on time to make that happen. But the briefs were pretty good, and I usually post only the briefs that I think are worth, from an educational point of view, putting on WhatsApp. But I think to myself, can you imagine a rating system across Pacer for everything, and lawyers aspiring to be able to say, well, I got, a 9.9 on the last 5 briefs that I read. I think law firms would love to know that data, but no one seems to be motivated to try to do it. But the data is all there. I mean, it's all publicly available, right?
Yeah. I can talk a little bit about the the connections that I see between fiction writing and legal writing. That may not be.
Why don't you do that? Because I think it's educationally valuable, and I think it's also helpful to know how you went about the work, because you must work in a particular way. I know you have an office, a home office, and your house is near the ocean and all that jazz. But I'm just kind of curious, what's your style of how you sit down for that couple to 3 hours in the flow, trying to get to the flow state of writing? Is it in front of a dictation machine? Is it in front of a word processing program? Like, what are you using? An outliner? Like, tell us how you go about doing the work.
No, it's just plain old typing on a laptop computer with ergonomic keyboard and Word.
Microsoft Word.
I don't dictate. I compose best when I type. And so I type, and I also, and this is kind of the same way I work with legal briefs, is I kind of type fairly good first drafts. In other words, I'm not of the school of thought that you just kind of puke out whatever's in your head and then go back and revise it. I kind of try to write a good first draft. Now, that doesn't mean that's my final draft by any means. And like I said, I actually very much enjoy going back and editing my own writing. But no, there's time, maybe before, when I was working more as in law, I would, do it on weekends. Now, when, I don't have a set schedule, I'll just say, if I've got a morning free, or, I don't have to take care of my granddaughter till the afternoon or whatever. Granddaughters, I should say. Now I got 2 of them here. And I'll just say, this is what I'd like to accomplish. I've got this story either I want to start, or I've got one that I've been working on, and I'm just going to sit down and work on it. I mean, I try to keep it so that it's still enjoyable.
Yeah.
That I don't want to make it into a job, because that's not my goal.
Right.
But the the relationship between legal writing and fiction writing, I think, is, and this is what all lawyers will say this, right? The best brief is one where you tell a story.
Right.
And you want to be able to tell a story. Just about anything you do with legal writing. Now, you got to be careful. You can't get too flowery or creative, because some judges don't like that. But I think just about every judge, and of course, when you get into a jury trial with a jury, you want to have a story. And so as a lawyer, you start to learn how to tell stories. And the nice thing about fiction writing is you get to make up the facts, right?
Right.
I mean, with the law, you kind of constrained. Although I always make the joke that I think some of my opposing counsel, who used to tell the judge my briefs were pure fiction, were part of my impetus to actually write fiction. But the other thing is, and this is something that I think maybe lawyers don't pay as much attention to. The word limits and page limits in legal writing really improve your writing. And when you get into now with a novel, it's different, because you can pretty much write it as long as you want, as long as you can keep the reader's interest. But with short fiction, there's various types of short fiction and creative nonfiction, and you almost always have word limits. And it's kind of rare to have literary magazines want to see something that's more than 4,000 words. And there's also forms of writing called flash fiction and microfiction. Flash fiction is generally under 1,000 words or less, and I've had publications there. And there's microfiction, which generally is below 300 words. In fact, there's a couple of publications that I've had that are linked on my website under the short stories tab, where the magazine that published them is called 101 Words, and they mean it. It has to be exactly 101 words, exactly.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting because often when you submit, and even when they're going to accept it, they say, well, we'll accept this, but here's a few editorial things we'd like you to change. And so sometimes when they do that with that publication, they say, you say, well, okay, well, if I take that word out or I change that word, then I got to get back to 101. So it's kind of, in a way, it's a little bit of a game, but especially writing flash fiction where 1,000 words, you got to tell a story and you don't have very long to tell it. That's really about maybe 4 double-spaced pages. And
Right.
you got to get your story arc, you got to get your characters, you got to get your conflict and your resolution and all that. And so I think that doing that also helps conversely when you're writing legal briefs, because you're used to having to make every word count. So I think there's been a lot of, in other words, I think being a lawyer and doing a lot of legal writing helped me as a fiction author, and being a fiction author kind of helped me writing as a lawyer too. So,
But the fiction author stuff really is relatively recent, isn't it, compared to the lawyer stuff? Because you've been practicing law for over 4 decades. So,
well, I always kind of wanted to write fiction, and I kind of started taking a few stabs at it kind of in my early 40s. And I wrote some stories, but I didn't get anything. I tried to get a few things published, and I just kind of got discouraged, and I got real busy. And then I think it was around 2009. So I was about 52, in my early 50s, that I really tried to go back at it. And then I got my first story published in 2010, I think it was. It was something I always wanted to do.
So when you think about your writing, just to go back to the 350 plus pages that you've written and now published, when you go back, do you think I wrote a detailed outline for how this would go, or was it a different process to get through what is it, like 16 chapters, if I remember what I read? Probably not.
66.
66, sorry.
Chapters.
Okay, I got the six. I got the 6 right, but I didn't get the other 6 right.
Well, one of the things
chapters.
I try to do is to write short chapters, because I think that makes the pacing better, especially with this type of a book, which is a mystery, and you want to keep people turning the pages and all that.
Right.
And I think and when you finish reading a chapter, there's sort of a sense of accomplishment, and you get through it. And if you want to read more, you turn the page and you read the next one. But if you kind of have long chapters, people get stuck in the middle and get tired and all that. So I don't really write outlines for fiction. It's sort of like I kind of it's like building an arch almost. I kind of start out with the beginning and the end. I know where I start out, and I know where I want to end up, and then I kind of figure out how to build the middle.
So in a way, the flow factor we're talking about, which I think is understudied, and there are people that do study it. There's a famous guy at the University of Chicago named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I was lucky enough to meet him when he was at Stanford and spend some time with him. And there is a psychological state, it's called flow, Flow, where you get immersed. And maybe that's what plays out in the middle, which is where you want to end, and how you began. And then you're deciding on things as you go along, which is, what is this dialogue going to be? And what's the conflict going to be here? And like that flow state is what produces the creativity, or vice versa. The creativity produces the flow state. And then you just get immersed in it and you go for it.
Well, the other interesting thing is I still remember like the first time I tried to write a short story. I mean, not, when I was an adult, not going back to school and all that. And I really was thinking, God, I can't imagine, writing dialogue is so hard.
Hmm.
And then I started writing dialogue, and it got to the point where I actually find it easier to write dialogue than than just explanatory text or action or all that. And I think part of it is once you get the character and you start building the character, and this sounds a little weird, I suppose, but they just start speaking to you. I mean, in other words, this is what this man or woman or child is, and that person is going to think a certain way and talk a certain way, and they just kind of start talking, and so you listen to your character, and you just kind of start taking down what they're saying to you. That sounds a little weird, I know,
But
but
are you keeping yellow pads with this is Jed and this is Sam and this is Sally? Like, are you trying to track the characters in some way to make them consistent with a sort of psychological archetype kind of thing?
no, no, it just kind of just keeps that keep it in my head. I don't plot it out. I don't really do a lot of, this is what I probably have done, where I get a chapter in my head, but it doesn't fit. I mean, it's not the next chapter in chronological time, and so I'll go and write that and just kind of put that aside and say, okay, now this I want to get here. It's not the end, it's not the beginning, it's somewhere in the middle, but it's not where I am in terms of writing. I'll put it aside, and at some point I'll figure a way to fit it back in. I do that. And or maybe if I just have ideas, I'll fire out some ideas and say, okay, chapter XX, without putting a name on it, have this guy do this, and or this happen or whatever, and kind of just put it aside. But that's about the most planning I do. Maybe I
Yeah.
should plan more. It might be easier.
No, well, there actually are pieces of software around that, particularly for people that are turning their books into screenplays. They'll
Yeah,
actually or do a book with the goal that somebody's going to pick it up for a screenplay, like
yeah,
literally try to build a set of characters as a separate knowledge base. Like in some
yeah,
ways, when you do a trial, at least when I do a trial, I think of how is this person going to be presented? Like, are they going to be presented as a very scholarly academic type, a street fighter type? Those archetypes juries pick up on right away.
right,
Are they
right,
fastidious? Are they sloppy? Do they
right,
wear a tie? Do they not wear a tie? Like, there's so many little cues that you can script. Obviously, you're the lawyer. You're writing the play. You're writing the screenplay. You're
right.
you're you're presenting the characters. You're directing the action. You're hoping they can carry it out. You don't want them to be too scripted because juries react poorly to that, but they've got to have a certain, sense. And expert witnesses that are even, sort of an exponential version of this. But I'm just wondering, are you thinking maybe this turns into a screenplay eventually and a movie or a series of episodes on Netflix or that sort of thing? Or are you not thinking that way?
Well, you can always dream. I mean, I don't know. Um, I think what I've got to do is try to figure out how to get more people to want to read it. That's the first order of business. I'm doing a marketing through uh, Facebook ads through the publisher I used. So not a fair number of people. I see the feedback on it, the diagnostics or whatever you want to call it. A fair number of people are seeing the ads. Some of them are
Mhm.
clicking on it. I mean, if everybody who clicked on the ads was buying the book, that would be good. But that's
Right,
that's not that's obviously not going to happen.
right.
So I've been looking at some other things and trying to get a broader audience for it. And there's various things, and so I'm considering those. I didn't know, I had no idea what I was doing when I got into this. And so I'm learning as I go along. It's a completely different situation than getting published in with the short fiction and all that stuff. It just completely, it's much more of a business. And I'm not particularly good at business, nor do I really like business. So this is the work part for me, trying to figure out how to get more people to see it. I was able to get my high school magazine to do a little blurb on me in the novel, so that came out yesterday. So and that's up in Sacramento. So I'm hoping, that's I don't know what the circulation is, but it's got to be at least a few thousand,
Yeah,
probably
I mean,
more.
these networks are with you forever, like your grade
Yeah,
school, your high school, your college, your graduate school, your law school, your business school, whatever it
right.
is, those networks are super valuable.
Yeah, and
And you
yeah,
publish into those networks and you'll definitely get
yeah,
some reviews
yeah,
for sure. And when you think about the investment, I'm guessing it's several thousand hours, probably even way more than that.
yeah.
It did result in something you're proud of. You should be proud of it. I thought it was a great book. I think it is a great book. I think you will get traction. But do you look back, I'm curious, do you look back and say, God, I wish I picked some more interesting topic of some sort, like a different style of topic that was more newsworthy. Like right now, I'm fascinated by, I'm just going to reveal this. I'm fascinated by the decision that Trump and the military are using to kind of wipe out these alleged drug dealers in Venezuela. I'm just fascinated because it would otherwise be considered a war crime, I think, to do what they're doing when people have kind of put up the white flag and said, we're giving up, we're basically hanging on to a boat that's sinking. Usually you have a rescue and then you have a prisoner of war, but they're like taking steps to more or less wipe out the evidence. Like that's what the news at least is saying happened with the latest strike
Yeah.
or second strike. And now there's a controversy about maybe really there needs to be a war crime review. That's very topical. That's a very topical subject, and you can obviously write both
Yeah.
fiction and nonfiction about it. But I'm kind of curious, you having put
No,
in the
no,
time and
no. I'm
obviously
I'm
doing something
happy.
that's more historical, do you look
No,
back
I'm
and
I'm
wonder,
I'm happy with what I did. In fact, the prior novel I wrote that's unpublished was actually kind of more fun because it is a legal mystery, but
mm-hmm,
it's more of a satire of Silicon Valley and the law business and all that. And I'm still thinking that it's probably a little stale now as a present day novel, but I'm thinking of making maybe setting it back like right around the .com boom or bust.
right?
And I'm happy. I mean, with the topics I've chosen, I'm good. So whatever happens, happens. So anyway, I'll wrap up with
Yeah, how do
just to
people
say,
reach you and how do they buy the book? They go on Amazon, right? You can get the Kindle
yeah, you
version,
can go
download it
on
instantly.
my my website is jgreco.com, very simple, jgreco.com. And there are links there where you can get to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Apple Books. The ebooks are available now everywhere. And the print books, from what I'm told from people who have been pre-ordering the print books, is they'll start delivering within a couple weeks from now. And so yeah, so it's out there. It's available, and I hope people will give it a shot. Again, if you go on Amazon, you can read, and I think probably true on Barnes and Noble too. You can read like the first four chapters free, and then I think there's the sixth chapter there.
It's the right name.
The Ghost Case Posse.
The Ghost, the Ghost Case Posse. I shortened it to the Ghost Posse. But do it with Joe Greco. Find it, download the Kindle version. The firm will reimburse you, and read it and provide Joe with some comments, and then decide whether the comments are worthy of putting up on Amazon. Because I can tell you, one of the things that really make a difference in book sales and really in the sales of services are getting comments and 5-star or 6-star, whatever the number of stars are max on Amazon reviews, because that actually leads to the search engine putting Joe or whoever is getting the highest 6-star reviews or 5-star reviews up to the
Fine.
top of the queue when someone says, I want to read something that's kind of in this genre. And that's kind of the way search engines work. And so, for example, for the law firm, for Computer Law Group, we've got a lot of 5 or 6-star, whatever the maximum stars are on Google. And I can tell you, a lot of folks have said to me when I'm interviewing them as to whether we're taking their case or matter is, yeah, I just searched for a lawyer in Silicon Valley that had the highest stars. And you guys are like outranking all these big firms. and they're like, well, I wanted to talk to you. So life in the 21st century, for better or worse, is all about getting the maximum number of stars and having kind of the reviews that prove that really people are doing it.
All right.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.